Should we get out of Iraq? Good evening, everyone. Welcome to a special 90-minute edition of Brian Lehrer Live tonight. It's a town hall forum that I moderated 2 weeks ago at Town Hall in Manhattan with Congressman Jack Murtha, former Senator George McGovern, journalist Salameh Nematt, and James Carafano from the Heritage Foundation. It was sponsored by Harper's Magazine and WNYC Radio. Here it is. And thank you all for coming out to participate in our democracy. This is really important. I'm honestly surprised that we are having this discussion tonight. Just a few months ago, Washington watchers were saying President Bush would order a major reduction in troops by now, timed for the midterm elections. George Packer wrote in The New Yorker, he came on my show and went many other places to say that the president was arguing for staying in while planning to pull out, that there were enough Iraqi troops being trained to begin an Iraqification of the war, and that was the plan, with the added political benefit of tangible progress to announce during this campaign season, with accompanying TV footage, of course, of tens of thousands of troops landing stateside and loving up their wives and kids. But obviously it's not happening. The U.S. is pinned down in Iraq, at least for now. Instead, they're giving more prominence to the top U.S. commander in the region, General Abizaid, a proponent of the theory of changing the Middle East that is actually titled The Long War. And in fact, one of our guests tonight is an originator of that theory, and we will hear from him, Dr. Carafano. So we are stuck between, let's admit it, two very risky choices. Risky for Americans, risky for Iraqis. Stay there and continue to be everyone's lightning rod with all that implies for continued warfare, or leave and create a kind of vacuum with all the danger that implies. For example, the national intelligence estimate that's been in the news, the partly declassified paragraphs from what we are being allowed to see, calls the Iraq war a powerful recruiting tool for jihadis, but also says a U.S. defeat in Iraq would serve as a further recruitment tool. So we will discuss those choices tonight and try to get beyond a shouting match with some serious people on several sides of this. And rather than have an all-panel debate at the beginning and risk dumbing this down into crossfire, we're going to try a different kind of format tonight. We will do about 20 minutes with our out-of-Iraq contingent in dialogue with me and have them compare notes and really get into the details of their plans. Then we'll have the Stay the Course team do the same thing. Then they'll mix it up, and then we'll take questions from you on the index cards that you have at your seats. I will announce a few times to pass them to the aisles, and we'll have volunteers to pick them up. I will say that as I've been reading and listening and thinking about the two basic positions here tonight, I realize there may even be a few slivers of common ground to work with, so we will see. To introduce our panelists briefly, of course you know Senator McGovern. He was the Democratic presidential nominee in 1972. He served 18 years in the Senate and 4 years in the House from South Dakota. He was head of the Food for Peace program in the Kennedy administration, and going further back, he was a bomber pilot in World War II. Congressman John Murtha entered Congress being elected in 1974 from the district in Pennsylvania that includes Johnstown and other areas east of Pittsburgh. He spent 37 years in the Marines and Marine Reserves, 5 years full-time, and served in Vietnam in 1966 and 67. He finally left the Marine Reserves in '89. William R. Polk is the senior director of the W.P. Carey Foundation, a graduate of Harvard. He taught at Harvard from 1955 to 61, when President Kennedy appointed him a member of the Policy Planning Council of the State Department. In '65, he resigned from government to become professor of history at the University of Chicago. He also established the Center for Middle East Studies there and was called back to the White House briefly during the 1967 Middle East War to write a draft peace treaty. Dr. James Carafano is one of the Heritage Foundation's leading scholars in defense affairs, military operations and strategy, and homeland security. He is the co-author of Winning the Long War, Lessons from the Cold War for Defeating Terrorism and Preserving Freedom, the first to coin the term long war. The author, he and his co-author, argued that a successful strategy requires a balance of prudent military and security measures, continued economic growth, the zealous protection of civil liberties, and the winning of the, quote, war of ideas against what they call terrorist ideologies. He served 25 years in the Army, rising to the rank of lieutenant colonel, graduated West Point, and has a doctorate from Georgetown. Salameh Nematt is the Washington bureau chief of Al Hayat, the International Arab Daily, based in London, and the LBC, the Lebanon-based Arab satellite channel. He took this post in Washington in March of 2003 after setting up a newsroom in London designed to serve the joint venture between Al Hayat and LBC. For a brief period in 1999, he served as head of the strategy unit at Jordan's royal court, an advisory post for the king. He resigned 2 months after taking the job due to policy differences with the government over democratic reforms, and returned shortly afterwards to Al Hayat. So please welcome all our panelists. So as I say, we will speak first with Senator McGovern, Dr. Polk, and Congressman Murtha. And Senator McGovern, Congressman Murtha, it's such a rare opportunity to have you on the same stage. I have to ask you, Congressman Murtha, were you a McGovernite in 1972?
I am now.
But seriously, give us a little bit of history of where you came from to be the leader of the Democrats for getting out of Iraq today. You served in Vietnam?
Yeah. I came as much to speak as to listen, and I remember agonizing over what was going on in Iraq, going to Kuwait right before the war started, believing that there were weapons of mass destruction. The military drew a line around Baghdad and said, when we cross that red line, they're going to attack us, and I believed that. 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, when they didn't attack us, I changed my mind and I started paying close attention to their effort to find these weapons of mass destruction. And then I started questioning the military as time went on, and I saw no plan at all for the transition to peace. Our military did as good a job as it can do, but there's a limitation to military power. And I've learned that in the years that I've been in Washington. And when I spoke out for two reasons. I go to the hospitals every week to see these young men and women who have been wounded so badly and talk to them and see the difference between when they started and their attitude today. And second is the fact that our military is being disassembled. It worries me that we don't have in the United States any strategic reserve, that only a few combat brigades are prepared to deter any major conflict. We couldn't deploy our forces. I predicted all this because I could see with the small volunteer army we have, we couldn't sustain a long deployment. Some of these folks are going back in less than a year, and they should spend 2 years at home in a year. And some of you know people like that. Some of you know relatives that go back year after year, and a tremendous strain on them. And of course, the credibility of this country, according to the polls, has been destroyed by what happened to Abu Ghraib because of insufficient forces, what happened at Fallujah when we put 300,000 people outside their homes. All those things contributed to the loss of confidence of the world in the way we operate. And then we started to mess with the Geneva Convention. And I saw, and so I knew that I needed to speak out against what I felt was a policy. In the past, I was always able to do this quietly behind the scenes. I've been involved in almost every major decision that was made in the White House and the Congress in the 32 years I've been in Congress. But I couldn't get through to them. I mean, it was like talking to the wall. Nobody paid attention. They just kept saying everything's all right, everything's getting better. And I would say to my staff, how do you measure progress in Iraq? 60% unemployment. We have electricity's below pre-war level, oil production below pre-war level, and incidents have increased from 400 just a year ago to 800. We had the bloodiest month for Iraqis in July and August, and yet they keep saying, stay the course. We're going to have to get out of Iraq, either next week or the week after that. We have to redeploy. I've been looking, and I want to listen in interest to Senator McGovern's plan, because I am absolutely convinced that we have to find a rational way to redeploy out of Iraq as quickly as possible.
Senator McGovern, begin to lay it out for us. Out of Iraq is the title of your book. How?
What we have done in this little book is spell out a step-by-step plan of how this can be accomplished in roughly 6 months' time with minimum damage to Iraq and minimum damage to the United States in our interest. We don't buy this cut-and-run nonsense. Nobody's asking for a race to the border. We'll put our troops out of that country in the same deliberate way that we put them in, I hope with a lot more deliberation, because they were rushed in there under falsehoods, a whole string of them. We were supposed to have found weapons of mass destruction imminently threatening to the United States. That's a lot of nonsense, as we now know. We were also told we were going to deliver democracy to the people of Iraq. You can do a lot with military power, but you can't drop it out of a bomber. I'm an old bomber pilot, and I know some of the things it can do and some of the things it can't. You can't do it with well-trained troops who aren't prepared in the knowledge of how to set up a government in somebody else's country. So we believe that systematically bringing our troops home from Iraq is in the interest of the United States. It's certainly in the interest of our troops. It's certainly in the interest of our standing in the eyes of the rest of the world. And we believe if it is accompanied by an effort to rebuild Iraq, it will be in the interest of the people of Iraq.
Dr. Polk, for the benefit of people who haven't read the article or the book, I'm going to do my broadcast journalist thing and summarize part of the 24-point plan, and I'm going to ask you to tell me what it all adds up to. Because when you say the U.S. withdraws, you really mean withdraw. You would include moving the U.S. Embassy out of Baghdad. You would include cessation of any construction of permanent U.S. military bases. You would include the withdrawal of what you call 25,000 mercenaries from the so-called security firms, and you call for the release of all prisoners of war in Iraq and the shutting down of all detention centers and even paying Iraq reparations. What, sir, does it all add up to?
What we've been trying to do is to recognize the realities of the problems we face. I have had the experience of following closely and being very closely involved in other guerrilla wars. I was head of the American Task Force on the Algerian War, and I watched the process of disengagement. It always results in a considerable amount of chaos. We have to recognize that that's the case. With 140,000 troops in Iraq, we haven't been able to prevent chaos. We certainly can't prevent chaos in the transition to the removal of American power. But there are certain things that we can do that will make that transition far easier. And one of the key factors that we have been advocating is the creation of a stability force under the United Nations, made up of perhaps 15,000 people from various other countries suitable or acceptable to the Iraqis, armed with small arms and with the mission only of keeping a minimal amount of public security for perhaps 2 years. What we've done in this plan all the way along is to indicate a timetable, an estimate of the possibility of success, an identification of what the dangers are, and to compare the cost of what we were advocating with the cost of not doing anything in Iraq. For example, the stability force, we estimate, would cost something on the order of $500 a day per man, an awful lot of money, roughly $6 billion over a period of 2 years. But it's important to recognize that that is approximately 2% of the current cost of trying to do the same job with American forces. So we would save somewhere between $200 and $300 billion on that particular item. During that period of time, we also think that it would be important to help the Iraqis in a number of ways to reestablish the elements of their own control over their own society. The police force is the most important, and we advocate an attempt to help them move in that direction. We don't advocate the recreation of an Iraqi army. We're now spending $2.2 billion to do that. And as a historian who spent a lot of time in Baghdad, I first went there in 1946. I have seen that the army in Iraq was a major detriment to the creation of civic institutions. So we don't think that this is an appropriate thing to do. Indeed, in the various guerrilla wars that I have studied closely, the attempt to create stability before sovereignty has never worked. Sovereignty always has to come before stability. And that's the main element of our advocating getting out of Iraq. As long as Americans are there as targets, there will certainly be no stability created. You mentioned the U.S. bases. I just might say briefly about those. The one major base in Baghdad, the so-called Green Zone, is estimated to cost upwards of $1 billion. It's to house a huge American force, the largest embassy, so-called embassy in the world. And we advocate getting out of not only that, but the large number of bases that we have created through Iraq. Until quite recently, there were 100 of these scattered around the country. Some of them have been turned over to the Iraqi government. But the 16 so-called enduring bases, some of which are the size of a small city, with facilities for 20 or so thousand people, with PXs and Burger Kings and bowling alleys and everything imaginable, remind the Iraqis of the way the British controlled the country. And what I think is so often missing in our approach to the world is a sense of the history of the people that we're dealing with. Iraq was not just a patch of desert in which a bunch of nomads wandered around. It was the cradle of our civilization. It's been in existence in various forms for thousands and thousands of years. And we are dealing with a people who have a long tradition of dealing with foreigners. The country has been unfortunately invaded and raped and overrun by people from all over the world. And we don't want to create a situation in which America is remembered as simply another barbarian invader.
Congressman Murtha, what do you think of their plan, as much as you've read of it or heard of it just now, including the idea of a UN stability force to replace our forces?
I read the excerpts of the plan on the way up here in the plane, and I don't think the Congress will be in the mood for the reconstruction part of it. I remember speaking on the floor about reconstruction. I said the most important part of the $87 billion that we passed initially was the reconstruction part. I think it cost much more than $25 billion. I don't think in the end that it's practical to be able to do that. I understand why it should be done. I understand that much of what's happened, that we've destroyed it, but I just don't think that's practical. Also, I think the Iraqis have to settle this themselves. I have to say that I listen, but I am absolutely convinced that the people that want us in there are Al-Qaeda. The people that want us in there are the ones that are fighting with each other, and as long as we're there, we're going to be actually helping them recruit people against us. I see with 130,000 people, 130,000 troops, and incidents getting worse. I keep saying over and over again, 130,000 people on the ground, and incidents have doubled per week since we've been there. The fact that we have no transition to peace, we didn't have the troops for that, and even if we'd have had the troops, I'm not sure it would have worked. I think the Iraqis have to settle it themselves. I hate to disagree, because some of the things we've already put in legislation, no permanent bases. I agree there shouldn't be a problem. They should close the prisons. They should, many of the things you recommend, but I just don't think the Congress has been in a mood. It's costing us $8 billion a month right now in Iraq, and it would only cost $8 billion. 1 month of that would take care of what they would like to do. But I'll tell you the truth, I just don't think it's going to happen. My experience is, listen to the CIA, listen to the intelligence reports. They've got to work this out themselves. I don't see any way that there's any particular plan that parts of this plan should be implemented, no question about it, but I just don't see that we can settle it for them. Partition, I've seen the partition plan. Maybe they have to do that. They're going to have to do that themselves. The United States cannot force any kind of plan on the Iraqis. The Iraqis are going to have to settle this themselves. And just one bit of history, we didn't address slavery in the original Constitution in 1789. We let it go. We said, no, we wouldn't form a country if we addressed slavery. So we waited to the Civil War, which my grandfather or great-grandfather fought in, and that happened some years later. They're going to have to settle this themselves. As terrible as that sounds, and as tragic as it is, we've become the enemies. Our troops are caught in a civil war that's going on right now, but the Iraqis have to settle it themselves.
Congressman, could I comment?
Senator McGovern, please.
You know, if there's anything that Bill Polk and I agree 100% with is what Congressman Murtha has just said. He hasn't had a chance yet to read this book, although it's a brief one that I hope all of you will read. But the last thing we want is for America to continue taking charge of Iraq. There isn't anything we propose here that we don't want to have done by the people that live in Iraq. What we are saying is that that country has suffered so grievously from the American invasion that we do have some obligations financially to assist them in reconstruction. But we would certainly agree with the Congressman's warning that it would not be withdrawal from Iraq if we continue to try to run the show, even the rehabilitation of the country. We're simply suggesting certain things that we think would ease the pain of the destruction this war has caused. If you read these points one by one, there isn't one of them that enhances America's meddling or its power to control events in Iraq. One of the reasons we advocate withdrawal is that we think we owe it to the people of Iraq, who are now probably at least 3 out of 4, and I think higher than that, in favor of getting this foreign army, which happens to be ours with some modest help from the British, to get those military forces out of their country, and then do what we can without meddling to pay some of the cost of rebuilding that devastated country.
Dr. Polk, very briefly.
Just one very quick point. I understand Congressman Murtha's objection to asking the American public to spend more money, but it's the summary of our plan is a cost of something like 3% of what it will cost us not to do it. That is to say, the total amount of money that we're advocating included in this plan is approximately $13 billion. This year, we're spending a little over $100 billion. The estimate of the Congressional Research Center that deals with government spending is something on the order of a rise of cost of 30% a year. So that if we don't do something like this plan, and we all recognize that this is a first draft and something on the table to shoot at, we will be involved in spending upwards of $400 to $500 billion. So this is a way of saving America money as well as using the money more effectively.
Let me just say, we've spent $962 billion in the last 9 months for defense. $962 billion. In the war itself, it's $500 billion. That's just the war costs. So there's no question about it would be, if we could work it out. The problem, the practical problem I see, and I'm interested in what they're saying because almost all the things that they've suggested are something that I would agree with. But I'm just not sure that the practical problem, we can help them rebuild until they get some stability. That's the thing that worries me.
Dr. Carafano, Mr. Nematt, thank you for your patience. Dr. Carafano, why not?
Well, first of all, I want to say I feel very comfortable sitting in the center. The second thing I want to do is criticize the Harpers because I think they, quite frankly, framed this event wrong and brought you here on false pretenses. Should we get out of Iraq? You know, quite honestly, you know, living and breathing this debate every day in Washington for the last several years, I actually have a tough time of thinking of any credible analyst, security analyst, either on the right or the left, who thinks that the United States should stay in Iraq over the long term. And you know, you frequently hear this kind of range of options of the let's get out now regardless of the consequences and the events on the ground. And quite frankly, nobody's really making that argument. I mean, Senator McGovern and Mr. Polk aren't making that argument. They're arguing for doing something in a disciplined, organized way. On the other hand, you hear that you do occasionally hear somebody saying, "Well, geez, we just need to put more people on the ground and you know, fight this counterinsurgency," and that, quite frankly, is a wildly impractical option. The United States military doesn't have the forces and couldn't get enough allies to do a sustained counterinsurgency campaign in Iraq. It would take years to make it successful. You wouldn't like what the country looked like when you got done. Where you have successfully suppressed insurgencies over the long term, and people hold these up as models of success, they're really not very happy places like Kenya and Algeria. So that's really not a practical option on the table. And I think really most of us are really in the middle, which is saying that, you know, how do we withdraw major military forces from Iraq in a disciplined way? And I think that's rightly where the debate should be. And I must say that, you know, having been in the military for 25 years, I taught at West Point. One of the things I did was and I also taught the Naval War Colleges. I made all my students recite, they hated this, the passage from Thucydides' Peloponnesian Wars, where at the beginning where the Athenians are arguing whether to go to war, and there's this wonderful speech where this gets up and says and warns about the dark. It says every war is a venture into the dark, that countries are changed by war, that wars are never predictable, that things are always different. And I think when I want to applaud Harper's for having this, because we should have these discussions. There are people dying. There are real issues. There are concerns about American power, the future of the Middle East, the future of Iraq, and these are certainly things that we are all worth taking time to get out and talk about and debate. So I think it's absolutely right. And I just want to make 2 points, and they're this: one is how you leave Iraq matters. And there are 5 consequences, I think, of leaving Iraq in the wrong way that people need to think about. One, and I'll just run through them very nice, they all have alliteration. Armies, energy, allies, Al-Qaeda, and average citizens. To have a civil war, you have to have an army. There's only 2 armies in Iraq. The coalition has one, the Iraqis have the other. We built it. If we left tomorrow, what could likely happen is each of the major ethnic groups, the Kurds, the Shias, and the Sunnis, would grab a piece of that army. They would have an army to fight with, and you would almost guarantee a civil war. The second one is energy. Iraq is, as we pointed out, their production's down. They're a marginal producer. Marginal production does make a big difference in the world we are today. Iran is being very aggressive, in large part because their oil revenues are way up, in large part because the United States is having trouble in Iraq. Sunnis, Saudi Arabia is really looking at ramping up production, as are a lot of other people in the world. And stability in production right now and getting to the higher levels of production over the next couple of years is going to make a big difference. So quite frankly, the longer Iraq remains stable and the longer it continues to produce and the stability it provides will make a difference in terms of global energy supplies. The other one is allies. I mean, I think this is the one point that really doesn't get discussed enough. The war in Iraq is changing. The enemy, who's the enemy when we invaded Iraq against Saddam, is not the enemy we're facing today. What most concerns people today is, and I think the most of the trouble really contains is Iran is actively seeking to bog, as Al-Qaeda had tried, and I think largely failed to really mount a really successful insurgency. And I really think that Al-Qaeda has been in the decline since 2003. Iran has really looked at Iraq as an opportunity to tie the Americans down, to distract the people from debating about Iran's nuclear programs in the UN Security Council. I think this also ties into the Hezbollah operations in Lebanon. And if you look at the cycle of violence over the last year, a lot of it is, I believe, Iranian-inspired, of fueling a Shia insurgency, which then re-enlights this Sunni insurgency, which was really started this thing of violence. People are looking in the Middle East to stop Iranian aggression, Iranian venturism, Iranian expansionism, and they're looking to the United States to do that. So how we leave Iraq and the shape we leave Iraq in and how we treat our allies in this region is going to matter a great deal. You know, Al-Qaeda would love to portray the U.S. withdrawal from Iraq's defeat. It's funny, because actually if you look on the websites now and these things, you actually see both arguments. On one argument is that the United States is intentionally causing Iraq to melt down because they want Iraq to break up and fall apart and fail, because the United States wants to keep the Arab world weak. So on the other one hand, they argue that the United States is doing this intentionally, but on the other hand, they would like to see the United States withdraw from Iraq in a way that they can portray this as a defeat. And then the fourth one, and the last one, is average citizens. And I just think this point just doesn't get discussed enough. There's still major intermingling between all kinds of ethnic groups in the major populations area of Iraq, and these are several million people. And if this does devolve into a civil war, what's going to happen is what happens in every civil war. Populations are going to move. People are going to pick up and they're going to move. And when they move, they're vulnerable. And what you're going to have is a humanitarian crisis which really dwarfs Rwanda and Darfur. And I do find it amazing sometimes that people who are so vociferous about wanting to get into Darfur and also very critical of the United States for not playing a major part in Rwanda, at the same time would argue, let's get out of Iraq regardless of the consequences, which would almost virtually guarantee an unprecedented humanitarian crisis. So if we may fail in Iraq, but if we leave wrong, we can guarantee failure. And I'll just leave with two assumptions which I think should be fundamentally challenged. One is I think it's too early to write off the Iraqi government. I mean, it's a government that hasn't been in power that long. It does have leaders who are serious about trying to lead the country. I do think there's a potential there to support them. And the other thing is I don't believe a civil war in Iraq is inevitable. A lot of people would like violence in Iraq and for their own purposes, but at the end of the day, civil war really doesn't benefit any of the major ethnic groups. It really doesn't benefit any of Iraq's neighbors. That doesn't mean you can't have a civil war in Iraq. Civil wars often happen by accident. But I do think that whatever plan we adapt, whether it's the McGovern plan or the plan the administration pushed forward or something that comes from the Congress, the key elements is it has to push the Iraqis to continue to work on the political issue, to bring the Sunnis and the Shias and the Kurds to the table, to work on the intractable political problems, and to keep the political process moving forward, to bring the sovereignty that Bill talked about. And at the same time, we have to help the Iraqis create the security forces they're going to need to face the many problems they're going to face in that country, whether it's Al-Qaeda or Iranian influence or the militias inside the country, because they're going to have to deal with those. And where I absolutely agree with Senator McGovern is only the Iraqis are going to solve this problem. And I'll just finish on this point. There's a great misnomer about the post-war era. People talk about America, we rebuilt Europe, and America rebuilt Japan, and the Marshall Plan rebuilt this and rebuilt that. And none of that's really true. The people who rebuilt Europe were the Europeans. The people who rebuilt Japan are the Japanese. I think historically it's almost impossible to ever find a case of nation building where a nation went in and built into other nations. Nations rebuild themselves with brave leaders who stand up and have courage to do the right thing, and by building governments that serve their people. And if the Iraqis do that, then despite their many troubles, I think the Iraqis will move forward. If they don't do that, I agree with Congressman Murtha. There's nothing amount of U.S. military power that can ever prevent the Iraqis from civil war. So we can help them not do this. We can abandon them in a way that will ensure this, but we can't ensure a future that's going to make everybody happy.
Thank you very much. Mr. Nematt, I wonder if you could help us with your expertise of the Arab world as someone who reports for Arab media from there and from Washington. I've read some of your writings, and I know you've said that Arab public opinion is much more pro-democracy and pro-American than many Arab media let on. I wonder if you can comment in that context how you think the Arab world, if we can generalize so much, would perceive a U.S. withdrawal a la McGovern, a la Murtha, as opposed to staying the course in the way that Dr. Carafano laid out.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start by saying that the reaction from the Arab world is going to be different if we watch the reaction from governments, which are basically non-elected governments, and the people who are oppressed by these governments. By and large, of course, we cannot just have a blanket kind of situation, but to varying degrees, most people in the region live under oppressive, autocratic regimes. So the regimes will be very happy that this so-called experiment in democratization in Iraq was aborted, and not only thanks to Iraqi resistance, because if we really look at what happened in Iraq, the overwhelming majority of Iraqis have not taken part in this fight against American occupation. The overwhelming majority of Iraqis actually went along with the American democracy project when they defied the threat of terrorism 11 million people went and voted with their feet. They went to the ballot boxes and voted in a process that was basically made possible by the Americans. 70% of the eligible voters actually voted. This is way higher than people who voted in the American elections. And we're talking about the threat of terrorism. The argument that we should be having today, in my view, is not whether we should pull the troops or keep them. The debate should be, not only should we win the war, how should we win the war? What's the best way to win this war? This should be the debate. I don't think anybody should accept any other option but winning this war, because, again, if we look back at Iraq, and the figures were horrific in July and August. We're talking about something like 5,000 people, Iraqis, perished in these 2 months. If we really look at what is going on there, who are the people doing the killing? Why are these people, Muslims, killing fellow Muslims? Most of the attacks are targeting other Iraqis, not the Americans. The government in Iraq today is an elected government in the freest elections in the history of the Arab world. And they have a parliament which was elected in the freest elections in the Arab world. These people are all on board with America. I agree that the majority of Iraqis, if you ask them, do you want the Americans to stay or to go, they would tell you, of course, there's nobody in the world who would accept a perpetual foreign occupation. But if you ask them, do you want them to leave now, they would tell you no way, because they know leaving now is inviting a genocide.
Thank you very much. Congressman Murtha, could I get you to react to two specific things that Dr. Carafano said, one of which Mr. Nematt also amplified? One is that a civil war that is leaving would just about cause an all-out civil war, if they're not in one already, with tremendous humanitarian consequences. Mr. Nematt even used the word genocide. And two, that pulling out does not set up trust in U.S. foreign policy for other allies who might see us as cutting and running when the going gets tough.
Yeah. This is what I hear the most when I talk about redeployment. But Dr. Polk in 1963 said we couldn't win in Vietnam. We lost 55,000 troops after that. When I came home in August of '67, President Lyndon Johnson said, this is over, we had a good election. Nice of them to use the election just like they're using it now. We had an election, and the war is over. Senator McGovern was way ahead of me then when he said that we couldn't win in Vietnam. I believed to the end that the American military, it took me a long time to understand the limitation of power. I do not believe there'll be more chaos. Matter of fact, the Iraqi people don't believe there'll be more chaos. It's hard to believe there can be as much chaos as there is now. I am absolutely convinced that if we redeploy to the periphery, not desert Iraq, certainly not, and I would even vote for reconstruction money. But the point is, we're going to be forced out either today, we're going to be forced out tomorrow, just like we were out of Vietnam. And there's no way in the world that we can sustain the deployment. We don't have enough troops. You talk about a draft, let me tell you something. You know how many voted for a draft? 2 of us. 2 of us voted for a draft. We don't have the troops to sustain the deployment. These young people, very small percentage of young people in this country are bearing the burden, and they're going to pay the taxes for this war in the long run.
So, Congressman Murtha, to be clear, is it your position that the only thing that we can do is let an Iraqi civil war run its course?
I believe that we have to redeploy. They're gonna have to settle it themselves, and I don't think they'll be near the carnage. The Iraqis say it won't be. The Iraqis themselves say that they'll settle this themselves. We had to have our own civil war, but I am absolutely convinced the United States staying there will not solve it, and we'll be forced to leave at some point. That's what I believe.
Senator McGovern, can I ask you to react to their specific point that it's too early to give up on the fledgling Iraqi democracy, that 70% of eligible voters voted, and there is the beginning of something worth continuing to help to give birth to?
I'm all for democracy everywhere. But I think that our continued presence in Iraq is creating terrorism, not democracy. And that's the findings of the American intelligence community. It's been leaked to the New York Times and other sources. They say that we've turned Iraq, which was not a terrorist country at the time we intervened, we've now turned it into the main recruiting grounds for terrorists who see the American involvement there as a perfect foil for stepping up the terrorist pressure. Yeah, let me make one side observation here. I got very impatient during the Vietnam War when I was speaking out against our continued escalation of that war. It started out with 16,000 advisors. It ended up with 550,000 American soldiers. And Congressman Murtha is the kind of man that puts his body where his mouth is. He's not a draft dodger. Neither am I. I fought in World War II, and he fought in the Vietnam War. I've never once criticized American soldiers in Vietnam, in Iraq, or any place else. This is a democracy where these young men are only doing what their government policy commands them to do. I'd feel a lot better about Dick Cheney saying we're going to stay the course if he hadn't ducked the draft 5 times. I'm not saying that people who object to a war don't have the right to say so, but he believed in the Vietnam War for other people to fight. People like John Murtha, it's fine for him to go there and risk his life. But you look over these neoconservatives who behind the scenes are pulling the straws on American foreign policy these days. Most of them have never had the smell of a battlefield. They've never got near combat. They think they're hawks, but they're really chicken hawks. And so I admire congressmen like John Murtha, and it's in the interest of everybody who believes in ending this war that he be reelected by a big margin this year.
Dr. Carafano?
Mr. Lehrer, could I just ask a question? I've been listening carefully to Mr. Nematt about how we have to stay until we've had a victory in Iraq. I wonder if he could define for us what it means to have a victory in Iraq. What does it mean to be victorious in Iraq? To lose another 50,000 young Americans and maybe 500,000 Iraqis? Is that what it's going to take to have a victory?
Mr. Nematt, he asked you.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, I will try to define victory here. Victory here is when the Iraqi army is capable of standing on its own to defend the country against those who are trying to undermine the very project that all people in the region aspire for, the democracy. Now, again, that's why it is important. I started saying it, but I did not go on. We have to go back to the elements of the war today in Iraq. Who are we fighting in Iraq? Did anybody wonder as to how come that 90% of the suicide bombers in Iraq, the most devastating attacks that have killed mainly Iraqis, 90% of the suicide bombers are non-Iraqis? What does that tell us? Why are all these foreign jihadists going all the way from something like 15 different nations to go and fight the war against the Iraqis, against the future of Iraq, more than it is against the Americans?
Is that a corroborated figure? 90% of the suicide bombers are non-Iraqis?
Yes, it's established by the Iraqi governments and by American sources. 90% of the suicide bombers.
Hang on.
Let me just to be accurate. 90% of suicide bombers, not 90% of attacks. But these suicide bombers are the most devastating. In other words, the biggest number of casualties in the war in Iraq are falling as a result of the suicide bombings that are targeting Iraqis, whether they are praying in mosques or the vegetable markets or anywhere in Iraq. And so what we're fighting there is not fighting the Iraqi people. We're not fighting an Iraqi insurgency per se. There are indeed Iraqis who are fighting the remnants of Saddam Hussein's regime.
So may I jump in and get an answer to Senator McGovern's question? What would be the definition of victory?
Okay, definition of victory is basically making sure that America and its allies do not abandon Iraq like they did in 1991, resulting in the murder of 100,000 Iraqis by the regime. Now, this time we're going to have something worse. Abandoning the Iraqis now means literally a genocide, because this is the American presence is the only thing standing against a genocide. Victory is not to leave until there are enough Iraqi troops, enough Iraqi police to really hold the security situation at home. And then I think America can leave victorious, not
Mr.
defeated.
Nematt, you're a journalist. I'm going to invite you to return the favor to the McGovern-Murtha side of the table and ask them a question. Do you have one for them?
Well, the question I would like to ask is, do you actually believe that any standing American president will ever agree, under the circumstances, to withdraw from Iraq, such as you are suggesting, considering the fact that the leading candidates or hopefuls for president in 2008 have basically moved more towards the right or to the center and not agreeing, in the majority of Congress and the Senate, not agreeing to pulling the troops immediately. Indeed, they just voted a few days to finance the war for the next year.
Well, I'm not depending on George Bush to get us out of Iraq. I think the New York Times, which most of us think is one of the better newspapers in the world, had a good editorial today in which they reminded us that when you have one party that has sweeping power, that controls the Senate, that controls the House, that has its men on the Supreme Court and its women, that controls the White House, all the cabinet posts, and they stay in power for a long period of time, it almost invites the kind of an authoritarian pattern that has developed with lots of corruption going with it. So I'm not optimistic that what Dr. Polk and I are advocating here is going to be embraced by the today's Republican Party. My mother and father were lifelong conservative Republicans, but they weren't neo-conservatives, whatever the hell that is. They were conservatives who believed in a balanced budget. They believed in conserving life in this country, not risking it in unwise wars. They were the kind of conservatives that I can respect. This administration, and I go into the politics of this because we're dealing with a political problem here as much as anything. The politics are that, no, it's probably going to be very hard to sell this package that we've offered here, even though I think it's grounded in a very careful study of the historical factors, the political factors, and I don't see how anyone can escape the conclusion that has watched this development in Iraq without seeing it's not going to lead to victory.
Congressman Murtha, could I get you on the politics also? We sit at a point where control of the House and the Senate may go to Democratic hands in a matter of weeks. Will that change the dynamic on this?
Yeah, I look at this a little differently. I look at this president as a failed president. And you can't sustain a war if the public's not for it. It's not sustainable. And the number of troops we have sending them back over and over, the public is turned against us. So in the end, if the Congress becomes Democratic, I think we have a unique time in history here that the Congress, Democratic, both Senate and House, can deal with the president from a basis of power. where the president's going to have to compromise on these things. He's not going to be able to continue. He doesn't want to have a failed president. He wants to leave a legacy of something. Most people don't think he can get him to compromise. I believe that if we deal from a basis of power, that we can get him to compromise. I think we can end this tragic situation that's dealing there. I think the Iraqis know where the bombers are. They know who they are, but they're afraid because of the hostility towards the Americans to tell anybody. They'll tell each other, and they'll get rid of the bombers. You won't see the bombers after we're gone. So I'm convinced that a Democratic Congress is absolutely essential to just like the senator said, to balance this thing out and to start a redeployment, a sensible, responsible redeployment out of Iraq, where Iran wants us there, China wants us there, Russia wants us there in order to deplete our resources. These young folks there are going to be paying the price and the taxes on this thing for the rest of their life.
Dr. Carafano, Senator McGovern and Congressman Murtha's main point, it seems to me, is that the lessons of history, of Vietnam in particular, of other insurgencies, and the trajectory of this war to date indicate that one way or the other, America is going to be run out of there, and we are going to have to leave it to the Iraqis. The only question is how much additional blood will be shed before that.
Well,
What's your response?
well, first of all, I'd like to criticize you because what you've done is kind of try to frame this as some big gulf between Congressman Murtha and I about, some kind of status quo, some kind of lead. I mean, I agree with the Congressman's basic points are fundamentally absolutely spot on. The only solution to the future of Iraq is an Iraqi solution. A continued U.S. military presence is not in our interest because it is a drain on our forces, and we can't sustain deployment levels of this. That's just a fact.
But to be sure, they're calling for pulling out in 6 months, and you're not, right?
Could I finish my point? Sure. Thank you. And appreciate that. The issue is how do you leave? And so what I'd like to do is, if I could shift the debate just a bit, is to start to talk about some of the specifics of the Polk McGovern plan, because it's a plan. And I think it deserves to be looked at. And let me just touch on the military piece, because of all of them, actually, it's the one that I find the most disturbing, which is, let's get a 15,000-man stability force in there. Okay. People have to realize what that means in military terms. If I'm going to deploy 15,000 soldiers to a country, how many of those soldiers are going to be out walking, doing security? The answer is, if you're lucky, about 1 in 3. In America, it's about 1 in 7. So if you have 15,000 soldiers in a country, at best, that means you've got 500 trigger pullers, because all the rest are driving trucks and doing logistics and everything else. Last time I checked, there are 24 hours in a day. Soldiers don't work 24 hours. If you're going to do sustained continuous operations, the kind of security things that Bill talked about, that means you're going to probably have 3 shifts. That means, at best, if you deploy 15,000 peacekeepers to Iraq on a typical day, because people are going to be sick and they're going to get injured, and they're going to go AWOL, you're going to be lucky to have 150 soldiers out on the street. Now, this is a country of 25 million people the size of California. Putting 15,000 soldiers in Iraq doesn't do anything. All it does is it basically puts those 15,000 soldiers at terrible risk to being held hostage by somebody.
Please,
no, sir,
folks.
sir, I'm sorry. He said 15,000. If you put 15,000 troops in Iraq, you'll probably have about 150 in the streets.
Hang on. Come on, folks. You know what? Let's give Senator McGovern a chance to respond to that. Is that terribly inadequate? And will those troops just be simply at risk? Our 150,000 troops, or whatever it is, are still terribly at risk.
First of all, they're not going there as soldiers. They're going as police officers. Bill Clinton talked about putting 100,000 more policemen on the street. They weren't soldiers. They were people who were trained law enforcement people, and they're not going to take on the insurgency. It's not the job that our Army is now engaged in, which is trying to put down this insurgency. The insurgency, we believe, will evaporate once the cause of it is taken care of. The cause of the insurgency is a foreign army that has been in the middle of Iraq for 3.5 years now. Even Richard Pearl, one of the original brass-knuckled neoconservatives, says that we probably, after deposing of Saddam 3.5 years ago, we probably should not have kept our army there beyond that length of time. But if you can get that kind of recommendation from Richard Pearl, it's not entirely radical for Bill Polk and I and Congressman Murtha and others to say the time has come to get this occupying force out of there if it was a mistake to leave them there 3.5 years ago.
Well, Senator, I don't disagree with you. I just don't understand what 150 police officers are going to do in a country of 25 million people. What's their purpose?
The Iraqi government presumably has other people that will serve as police officers. This is something to supplement.
The Iraqi already has over 100,000 soldiers. I mean, what is 15,000 peacekeepers? 50 people on the street. What are they going to provide? I don't understand.
They're there to arrest people who break the law. They're not to take on the insurgency.
But how many people? Well, how many people are they going to arrest? 150 people.
It's not 150, it's 15,000.
Which will put about 150 people in the street, and they'll operate. Sir, they will, and they'll operate in squads of. Wait a second. They'll operate in squads of 10. If they go out and arrest one person, those 10 people will come off the street for their tour. So now you're down to 140 people. If they arrest 2 people, you're down to 130. So I mean, 150 people isn't even enough to secure a Baghdad neighborhood.
Would you be happier? Would you be happier?
Let's listen to Senator McGovern.
I'm wondering if you'd be happier if we didn't keep these 15,000 people there during a transition period. Would it make you feel better if we said we wouldn't do that?
I wouldn't put 15,000 peacekeepers at risk with an impractical mission, no.
Well, the police officers in Iraq are at risk, or the police officers here in New York, people who become policemen.
Sir, that's their country, and their job to defend their country.
Right.
I wouldn't put 15,000 peace officers in the middle of Iraq. Because they wouldn't account, because it's not a practical mission, and they would just be at risk.
We're going to lose Congressman Murtha in 5 minutes. So, Congressman, I want to give you a word before you go, and then we'll continue for a few minutes after that. But, Congressman, you can say whatever you want, but also one other thing from their presentation that I'd like you to react to is the issue of Iran and increasing Iranian influence in Iraq if the U.S. withdraws quickly, and the implications for the United States of that.
I've always believed that Iran was a much bigger problem than Iraq. I believe that the reason Bush 1 decided to stop and not go into Iraq because he wanted to balance it out, to balance Iraq versus Iran. But having said that, they're an independent country. I don't believe they'll have the influence, Iran will have the influence that we seem to predict they're going to have. Besides, these predictions have been so wrong. We spend more money than all the rest of the world on intelligence. But it's so sanitized by the time I see it, I have to go out in the field and talk to the people in the field to find out what the hell's going on. So I am convinced. I'm convinced that, and I want to look at some of the suggestions Senator McGovern has. I'm not sure we want to leave anybody there. They want to leave advisors there and so forth. I'm not sure of that. I understand what he's saying, but I'm just not sure that I think the Iraqis will be able to handle this themselves. There'll be you think genocide, they predicted all kinds of things that might happen if we didn't go in. They predicted a mushroom cloud. They predicted that we would liberate them and we'd spend $50 billion. In the meantime, we spent $500 billion. So I am convinced there's been so many misstatements and mischaracterizations. We have to get back to the real facts. The Congress of the United States is going to vote for everything the troops need out in the field. We need a change in direction. We need a change in policy. We need to send a message to this president that the public is fed up with the direction of this war. We can't sustain it, and a number of young people are paying a tremendous sacrifice. So I appreciate the education I've gotten today, and I understand the differences of opinion here. But I think the Iraqis have to handle this themselves. I think they'll take care of the suicide bombers because they know who they are. We don't know who they are. There's no way we can tell who they are. and I think there'll be less chaos if we are able to redeploy to the periphery, not deserting the Middle East, but available not to interfere in a civil war, but if something happens that affects our national security. We shouldn't go to war and put men in harm's way or women in harm's way if we don't have a threat to our national security. We should go with sufficient forces, and we should have an exit strategy.
Yes. Do we have a copy of the book here? Who wants a copy of the book? It's all marked up here.
Dr. Carafano, a question from the floor, from the audience, which says, Senator McGovern and Dr. Polk laid out their plan. What is your plan?
Well, I don't have a plan. It's not my job. No, I do policy, not politics. I mean, it's my job to look at what the administration has done and critique it. It's my job to look at what other people have proposed and critique it. If I wanted to make the plan, I'd have stayed in the Army and worked in the Pentagon.
Okay. Dr. Polk, another aspect of your plan, and I'm sorry, I had it right here. Well, basically, you're calling for the United States government to express condolences to the Iraqi people. And according to your book, that would do as much as anything else that we've talked about here to help bring peace in the future. Why do you think an expression of condolence could be that powerful? And then I'm curious to get Mr. Nematt's reaction.
I think the issue is, first of all, that an awful lot of people have been hurt. A lot of them were civilians who had nothing really to do with the war. A lot of them were opponents, or at least the oppressed people under Saddam Hussein. We don't have to say that we're guilty for doing things, but I think we as a people should express the feeling that we have the sense of fellow feeling for people who have been hurt. That was, the word actually occurred in the first bill that was passed in the American Congress in 2003 for condolences to the Iraqi people. It was not our invention, it was something that Congress had passed before. But could I revert just for a minute to the issue of numbers that we've been talking about? That great practitioner of guerrilla warfare, Mao Zedong, warned us that there were really two kinds of forces that were involved in guerrilla war. There were what he called the fish and the sea. The fish were the combatants, and they were relatively few in any guerrilla war. For example, in Algeria, there probably were never more than 13,000 combatants, and they fought against 485,000 French troops. In Iraq today,
Come closer to the mic, if you would.
In Iraq today, the guesses that I have heard run up to something like 20,000 people who were involved in the insurgency. Whatever the number is, they are an infinitesimal part of the forces against them. But what seems to happen in every guerrilla war, and I'm in the course of writing a book about this that deals with 12 guerrilla wars that we have been able to monitor fairly closely. At the end of the withdrawal of the foreign forces, the sea, the people, stop supporting the fish. And at that point, either the fish, the combatants, go into the government, as they have in, for example, as Tito did in Yugoslavia, Ben Bella did in Algeria, various other people, or they become truly outlaws. And at that point, the population stops supporting them. If the people of Iraq didn't support the combatants in Iraq today, there wouldn't really be a very major problem. But in fact, they are given shelter, they are helped in supplies, and they represent something that is attractive to enough of the Iraq people that they are supported. So the idea of our notion of 15,000 people is not that they would take on the job of suppressing the insurgency, but that they would, together with other forces, the developing Iraqi police, which we also call for and support, and also the use of local peacekeepers in each neighborhood, each small community would cumulatively be a force that would be able, with the lack of public support for the violent people, would bring a degree of tranquility. We recognize that this is not going to be an easy thing to do, and there certainly will be a certain amount of chaos involved in the transition. We haven't been able to prevent that with 140,000 troops, and we certainly won't be able to prevent it without the troops there. But that is the direction it seems to us that we have to move in.
Mr. Nematt, on that and the power of condolences for all the loss of life in Iraq, if you think it has power?
Well, I fully agree that when in the course of conducting warfare, you end up sometimes killing innocent civilians, then there should be an official apology by the military authorities that are in charge on the ground and by political leaders. But you don't apologize if you kill your enemy simply because he did not succeed in killing you. So we have to differentiate between these two things. And here, I'd like to question the term, this broad term of insurgency, and the question of the fish and the sea. I mean, the sea in Iraq has voted in the elections. They elected a government under American auspices, helped by the Americans. They elected a parliament, an overwhelming majority. Again, to re-emphasize the point that the war in Iraq is a war by proxy. There are Iraqi elements, mainly a minority in the Sunni minority in Iraq, is backing the fighting. You have of course, the former Baathists, who are few in numbers anyway in Iraq, and we have half a dozen countries in the region with their intelligence services, the Iranians sending the IEDs, the Syrians sending the recruits for the Al-Qaeda. And this is why, when you ask Iraqis, the representative Iraqis, parliamentarians and government, tell them, do you want the Americans out? They'll tell you, of course not. Not yet. We want them out, but not yet, until we're capable. And that's, again, to go back to the question of insurgency. And, I'd like to ask Polk on this. Where has he ever heard of a leader of an insurgency in a country that is a foreign national? Who is the leader of the so-called insurgency in Iraq today, if we pause to think about it? Who is the leader? I tell you who's the leader. The most visible leader, after Zarqawi, who's a Jordanian, not an Iraqi, was killed, the leader of the so-called insurgency, which is mainly terrorist people, killing innocent people most of the time, is called Abu Hamza al-Masri. He's Egyptian. So if this is really a national insurgency that is defying the national consensus that elected this government and elected this parliament, if this is really a national insurgency resistance, how come it's led by foreigners? I think we should pause and think about this.
Dr. Polk, he posed that to you. You may respond.
There certainly are foreigners in Iraq. Colin Powell went out and decided, I think there were over 2,000 some years ago, when most other people thought there were perhaps 24. We don't know a great deal about who all the people are. I don't think it makes a great deal of difference. The insurgency in Afghanistan, for example, was that we largely created, we and the Pakistanis, was largely staffed by people who were outside of Afghanistan, but nobody thought that it was an un-Afghan operation to fight against the Russians. The people were certainly incorporated into the local stream of politics. And it seems to me one of the things that I have always heard from people in the intelligence business is it's very, very difficult to insert foreigners into a situation like Iraq unless they really do encapsulate the things that the people who they are sent to work with approve of. And if the Iraqis today were able to follow from this election, which you referred to, and I think Congressman Murphy was quite right in mentioning that there was a similar, very highly touted election in South Vietnam. in the 1960s, which ultimately didn't produce anything. But if these people were not accepted by the local population, they would be very simple to catch.
Dr.
Yeah,
Carafano.
I just wanted to take the opportunity to revise and extend my very flippant remarks about a plan. There actually is a plan that works, I mean, historically, and they actually had a great name for it during World War II. They called it the Disease and Unrest Formula. And the guys that were planning the occupations for after World War II said, look, there's 3 things you have to do when you occupy a country before you can leave, both practically and morally. So you have to prevent a large-scale humanitarian crisis from, death from disease or starvation or whatever. You have to establish a legitimate government. You have to establish legitimate security forces to support that government. When you've done those 3 things, you're done, and you should leave. And quite frankly, that's a formula that we ad hoc'd our way into World War II. It doesn't guarantee you that an insurgency is going to be solved. It doesn't guarantee you that the country is going to turn into a land of milk and honey. But it does guarantee you that you've built a country that has a fighting chance. And so I think whatever plan it is, if it doesn't have those 3 components, if it isn't, there's some notion there that you can avert humanitarian crisis, that there's a legitimate government that you're handing off to that can look after the people, and that they've got some kind of security force that they can extend their authority over the countryside and do good things, then I think that then you are just cutting and running. And I must say that there are things in the Polk McGovern plan that actually like, because they actually do recognize the need for these 3 elements in there. And whatever we do, I think if we can't do those 3 things, then pretty much we're just going to guarantee failure. But again, we may get everything right, do those 3 things and leave, and Iraq still may melt down, because the future of Iraq is in the hands of the Iraqis in the end.
So, Senator McGovern, here's a question for you from the audience that asks, how do we rebuild when we have not been able to rebuild to date and production of oil and electricity are below pre-war levels?
Well, it is very hard to rebuild in the middle of a war, and we would argue that the best way to reduce the dimensions of that is to take the American Army out of there. I continue to believe, based on everything I've studied and read and the conversations I've had with men like Dr. Polk, that we didn't have an insurgency in Iraq until we put the American Army into the middle of their country. And so that's a basic fact, that's when the insurgency began and began to make itself felt in the life of the people there. So there's no way that either Bill Polk or I or anyone else can tell what's going to happen to Iraq once we leave. We don't even hint that we think we know exactly what's going to happen. Neither do we know, and no one can answer this, what's going to happen if we stay. What is happening is that every day Americans are dying and Iraqis are dying, and the country is being ravaged by this insurgency. It's our hope and our belief that that insurgency will gradually disappear if the American Army is taken out of there. I've been thinking tonight about Vietnam a lot, sitting next here to a Vietnam veteran, Congressman Murtha. We were told year after year during that long 20-year American involvement in Vietnam that it may have been a mistake, but we can't pull out now, or there would be a bloodbath in that country of just untold dimensions. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese government would simply slaughter everybody who had sided with us in the war. The second thing that would happen is that one country after another in that vicinity would topple to communism as so many dominoes. Neither of those things happened. Once we got our army out of Vietnam, one of the bloodiest wars in memory, almost overnight, the Vietnamese became our friends. I was there 3 or 4 years ago. We were warmly treated, not because I was a critic of the war, but because almost every Vietnamese we talked to told us that they had never had anything against the American people. It was our political leaders that brought on that war. And as I say, the Vietnamese have been our friends ever since we left their country, nor did any countries next door fall to communism. You had this madman in Cambodia, Pol Pot, who was systematically slaughtering his own people. And guess what country went in and stopped that? Hanoi, and a part of the Vietnamese army that moved in, took Pol Pot out of power and stopped that genocide. They probably should have had the Nobel Peace Prize for doing that. But in any event, we are convinced that if we're ever going to stop this slaughter now going on in Iraq, the first step is to get our army out of there.
Dr. Carafano, you can respond if you have a different take on history, but here's a question for you from the floor that asks, Dr. Carafano suggested that this forum is based on a false premise, that the question of whether to leave is itself a straw man argument, for he alleges everyone agrees that we must pull out. But it seems to me that the opposite is true, for the president is convinced that we must continue. So can you put this in the context of your theory of the long war?
My purpose here is not to defend the administration and the administration's policies. I mean, if you want to ask the administration about what their policies are and where they, then you should go ask them.
Okay. Can you talk about what you have said tonight in the context of your theory of the long war?
Again, I'm flippant, but again, the administration, well, in a sense, the administration has created a dilemma for itself, because the president has said, and which was the right thing to say, that the American forces will stand down as the Iraqi forces stand up. I found that very encouraging and very heartening. That, unfortunately, is not what's happened. What's happened is the American forces were preparing to stand down until this latest round of Sunni Shia violence kicked up. Mostly, I would argue at the instigation of Iran. And then what happened is they told the military commanders in the field to do both things. They said, train up the Iraqi security forces and put a lid on the violence in Baghdad. Well, you know what? They can't do both. And I think military commanders try to do both. And so I think they've gotten very conflicting guidance from Washington. Is we want to get out, we want to pull out, we want to get the troop levels down, but at the same time we want everything to be nice, peace, and quiet in Iraq, and you can't have it both ways. I mean, the key to getting the U.S. military forces out of Iraq as quickly as there you go, Freudian slip. Out of Iraq as quickly as possible is to turn those tasks as much over to the Iraqis. And I agree with Senator McGovern and Dr. Polk. It's bad for a long-term U.S. military presence in Iraq. There's no question about that. The U.S. military presence in Iraq is a magnet for bad people to come into that country. There is no question about that. The longer the U.S. military forces are there, the more that the Iraqis who are in power can push off the hard decisions and lean and get dependent and on U.S. military stepping in and solving the problem. That is not a healthy situation. So the U.S. military forces have to come out. The burden has to shift over to the Iraqis. The administration, I think, wants to go that direction. I'll be frank. I don't think, in what I've seen in the last 6 months, I don't think the policies have really pushed hard enough in the direction to do that. So I do think there is room for concern, and that's why I think that debates like this and plans like this are the right thing to discuss and talk about.
Senator McGovern, before we go, I'm sorry to raise this. I know you've been asked a zillion times, but you are a symbol to many Democratic strategists of how not to get elected during wartime. And maybe we saw that fear in the way the Democrats ran away from Congressman Murtha's resolution when it was actually introduced in the House. I know he's very frustrated with that. Anything you want to say to Democrats in Congress or running for Congress who might even be cringing at the idea of you and Murtha on the same stage for a photo op?
Well, since politicians are prone to do this, they might take a look at the polls in this country, which shows a steadily decreasing support for continuing the war. I do a lot of moving around the country. I still do a lot of speaking. But I talk to people in hotel lobbies, in airplane terminals, on the street, in various places. What I find is increasingly the political view is that the war was a mistake. We never should have gone to Iraq. Pretty much the consensus that now exists towards the Vietnam War. Just about every American you encounter thinks it was a mistake. And the sticking part is they will then say, but I don't know how to get out. I don't know how we just walk out of there. What's going to happen then? Is there going to be a big bloodbath or a huge civil war? As I look at it, I think there's a civil war going on right now in Iraq. And I think the best way to begin the process of working down that civil war is what I think we pretty much agree on here tonight. We need to find a way to turn over power to the Iraqi people. And that's not going to happen as long as we have 140,000 U.S. troops over there. We're going to be the dominant factor, and we're going to be the target. I was in Paris on the day 9/11, 2001. I was leading a mission to Africa, but I went to Paris to talk to some of the officials there first. And while we were having lunch with the editorial staff of the International Herald Tribune, a young man came in and said that a plane had hit a big building in New York. I said, well, it must have been some pilot that lost his way trying to land at LaGuardia or Newark or Kennedy or wherever. A few minutes later, he's back and said that another plane had hit another building. And then, of course, the stories came in and we learned what had happened. Every person around that table, half of whom were French people, were almost in mourning over that. I called on people from the president of the country on down the next day or two. Every one of them was almost at the point of grief over what had happened to the United States. The leading newspaper in Paris, Le Monde, came out with a headline that wide and big letters like that: "Now we are all Americans." And we found that attitude not only in France, but in Germany, in the Scandinavian countries, in Italy. We went on our tour of Africa, the same thing there. What has happened to that devotion and sympathy for the United States? Today, it's embarrassing almost as an American, and this pains me because I've always believed we live in the greatest country on earth. We have to be great when we make these huge mistakes and still survive and eventually right the situation. But it's really sad what has happened to the stature and the respect that the rest of the world has for our country today. And much of this stems from this foolish enterprise in Iraq that has so damaged us all around the world. I'd like to see America recover the respect and the admiration and even some of the affection that we once enjoyed. I really think that's the greatest source of American power and influence in the world, that people trust our institutions, they trust our ideals. They're terribly distressed over what they believe to be a perversion of the best values and ideals and tradition of this country. And I think one long step towards reconstructing and rebuilding that admiration is to stop this fruitless military operation in Iraq and do as thoughtfully as we can. And I think you'll find in this book, we're not deserting Iraq. We're not deserting our troops. We're trying as best we can, as people that are old enough to know something about what war does and some of the things that can go wrong, and then to come up with a sensible answer. I urge every one of you to read this book. The reason I left the stage, I was trying to catch Congressman Murtha, who asked me for a copy of it, but mine's so marked up, I was ashamed to give it to him. But please pass this book around and talk it over with your neighbors, and if you have ideas how we can improve this plan, we're just a couple of human beings who've made our share of the mistakes. Let us know what you think about it.
Thank you. Thank you all. However, I want to give the final word of the evening to Mr. Nematt, and ask him to respond to Senator McGovern's perception of how the United States is seen and the direction that that's going since 9/11. Do you see it in any more optimistic terms than he does?
Well, I cannot disagree with the senator over, his perception of, this growing anti-Americanism in the world. But I would really like to look at the elements of this anti-Americanism. Where did it come from exactly? What are the elements that made up this kind of image? And then we find that, to begin with, we had a lot of that before 9/11, even before the war on Iraq, to begin with. True, things have gotten worse. I think that part of the reason why the situation got worse in terms of anti-Americanism is that there are many powers in the world who would like to see America fail, and they would like to see America in the worst possible light, portrayed in the most possible light. That could apply to some European friends and their media, which has consistently been hammering anti-American stuff, not only since 9/11, not only since the Bush administration, but they've been doing this for decades now. And I think that the other factor is that the Europeans do have a kind of, in general, they have some kind of a complex, because they feel helpless vis-à-vis America being capable, in the sense that ethnic cleansing was taking place in the middle of Europe, and the Europeans were helpless watching it until the Americans, the Clinton administration, came and actually waged war on Kosovo, on Milosevic, and they ended up basically stopping the ethnic cleansing that was taking place, scandalous ethnic cleansing, and eventually brought down the Milosevic regime.
And how much has the Iraq War contributed?
I think the Iraq War contributed a lot, because people also are being confused, just like I come across people here who have never been in the region, who've never seen things from the other perspective, which is, people see on television car bombings, people getting killed every day, hundreds and thousands of people are getting killed, but they're not really looking at who's doing the killing and why. How come the leaders of the insurgency are non-Iraqis? How come the majority of the Iraqis are with America and they voted in the elections? How come the representative government and parliament in Iraq are on America's side, and their leaders come and visit the White House and meet with the officials? And we realize that the media plays a role in basically, of course the situation is pretty bad in Iraq, but it's not pretty bad because the Iraqis don't want us. They don't want the Americans to be there. It is very bad because all the forces, anti-democratic forces in the region, I'm talking about countries, and I'm not only talking about Iran and Syria alone, I'm talking about many other countries, authoritarian, oppressive regimes who do not want the Iraq experiment to succeed. Their media is feeding the global media. They're fueling this anti-Americanism because it serves their strategic purpose, which is the failure of the Iraq experiment, so that it will not be replicated anywhere else in the region.
So, ladies and gentlemen, go and discuss among yourselves. Please thank Harper's Magazine. Please thank our panelists.